Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Gianangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast, and it is my extreme honor to welcome a new guest for this special episode for a very special project taking place this year in New York City. I'd like to welcome onto the show Justin Garascia, who is a playwright, a theater maker, filmmaker based in New York City. He's a Midwesterner. We have that in common. And he is very soon going to be putting on the production of a play based in the Renaissance period on the coming of age of Michelangelo. Renaissance people, let's give a warm welcome to Justin Garascia.
Hi, friend. Thanks for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here.
So I want to talk about this project you're working on because I'm really excited about what you're doing. The show is called Mikey. Could you walk us through the framework of your project, what you're here to talk to us about, a bit of what inspired it, and what your hopes are for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Mikey is the queer coming of age story of Michelangelo, and the development process has been, I started writing it like 3 years ago, and that was after my first trip to Italy. The play covers 23 years of history about the artist, and it covers what history might have left out, spanning from the sculpting of the David to the painting of the Sistine Chapel. And we have our initial workshop presentation at the Tank Theater here in New York City this May 19th through the 31st, selected dates through that period. We have 5 performances coming up. So it's been a lot of fun. We recently had a sold out first public reading at the Drama League here in New York and had about 50 people there. And the audience response was wonderful. So I'm really excited to get it up on its feet and continue developing it here.
Oh, that's extremely exciting. We had the opportunity to meet you and I and our partners last
Yeah,
year here in Florence, and it was really good to meet you guys. And I wanna know what
loved
for
it.
you, what is traveling to Italy, its role in your creative process, and even this last trip that was so close to this moment of production for you. How has this been useful for you in this process?
Yeah. I mean, my husband recently sent me a meme on Instagram just about like how important travel is. And I think coming to Italy for the first time, I'm an Italian American. My family's been in the United States for 4 generations now, but going to Italy for the first time and just immersing myself in the culture and seeing the art of people who I've loved for so long for the first time was really inspiring. And I just remember standing in front of the statue of David and standing under the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and starting to like build this narrative in my head about really approaching it from curiosity, wondering what Michelangelo's relationship to his own work was like at that time, and also the relationships of the people around him. And that's when I really started to think, oh my God, there's a story here. And I mean, I had the headset on, standing in front of the David, and it was talking about how he worked on it for 3 years. And I was like, wow, I've been working on this one screenplay for 6 years now. That's just living in a drawer. Like, what would he say about that? And I started this like shame spiral a little bit in my head in this comparison between the two artists. And I was like, don't even go there. And that's where it all started to just unfold from, is just this wondering of like how he might have been approaching the work at that time. And yeah, it was great seeing it. That was in 2022. And then in 2025, on another trip to Italy, and we were there for a wedding, and that's when we were able to connect in Florence, which was so much fun.
Yeah, it was. And then it was especially nice because I remember we were walking down Via Tornabuoni and we popped into Santa Trinita Church to see the Sassetti Chapel. Um,
Yes.
because a lot of your characters are this moment in Florence at the end of the 1400s to really look at these contemporary figures that are so part of your creative process and to show contemporary portraits of them by Ghirlandaio and to stand there with you was actually quite an exciting experience for me anyway.
Yeah, me too. No, and also my husband, we were like, that was one of the highlight moments of our trip, just on a whim being able to discover something new with somebody who was so passionate about it. So thank you for that.
So let's talk more about these historical figures, actually, because what you're doing is creating characters for the stage based on historical figures. And I'm curious about your creative process, especially there's two people in particular, Piero de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and the architect Bramante.
Of course, like Michelangelo was the initial way that I discovered your podcast. And when I searched it on Spotify, like this came up, and I was so glad to dive into the history of the artist and discover more about him. But yes, the Bramante is a perfect antagonist in the story of Michelangelo, and Piero really started to come to life once I started to dig into the timelines of these characters. Um, but I also just want to preface like Michelangelo. I one thing that I really appreciate so much about your work is just this curiosity that LGBT people were part of the Renaissance and were in these stories. And there are moments of history that might soften that narrative and not lean into it. So I really just appreciate your curiosity and taking a deeper look into that. And that's where the story really started to unfold, is like giving room to this narrative. If Michelangelo were queer, what would his life have looked like in the relationships around him? And so just digging into the timeline about like when the David was created and like where Piero was in space and time at that point. And that's where I started to build and really lean into like what these relationships could have looked like. Michelangelo, correct me if I'm wrong, but 1489 is when he moved into the House of Medici. And what if there was a secret relationship? And growing up closeted and gay, I was like, there was a very nuanced way to those relationships, and wanted to explore like 500 years ago what that could have looked like then. And that's really
Right.
where this started to unfold. So that was specific to Piero. And
Right.
yeah, the House of Medici is just this perfect backdrop for what that could have looked like.
No, and it is, and we've talked about this a lot. I'm more academic. You're an artist, so you're making art out of history, and I do art history, right? So they're different things, but equally important. But the backdrop of the Medici circle is, we say queer. Queer is a modern term, but it's one that we use theoretically when we think about the past. We're not saying that they had these identities, but the idea that there was definitely quite ample examples of homoeroticism within the Medici court is what do we call that? Fodder for the creative queer imagination, right?
Yes, absolutely. And like you recently talked about too, about just Poliziano and like what that influence could have had on Piero and young minds like that, is like as they started to develop and come into their own. And also what was going on in Florence with the officers of the night, which you recently talked about on another interview, like was so informative in just shaping like what these characters were dealing with on the ground at that time. So it's all coming together in a really unique way, and really coloring a beautiful story. So we talked about too Bramante being an antagonist, and he's so interesting. Have you ever talked about him on the podcast much?
Oh, I almost do nothing in the 16th century. I think I mentioned him because Bramante starts in Milan. So I think I
Yes.
mentioned him when I was talking about Milan because his architecture appears in the paintings, but then he goes to Rome and the podcast, we will get there. We're going to talk all about Rome soon. And Bramante was, for everyone listening, this sort of history it starts in Florence. The history behind the scenes for the play here starts in Florence, but then of course when the Medici are thrown out, Michelangelo leaves and goes. He becomes pretty relatively well known, and then he gets invited to Rome to paint the Sistine Chapel. He had already been to Rome at that point, but so that's the time frame. And within that amount of time, Bramante ends up in Rome too to do the architecture for St. Peter's, among other
That's right.
things, right? Among other things. So that's the trajectory here. of the play. And no, I haven't gotten as far as Michelangelo and Bramante in Rome on the podcast yet, but we will.
Love Bramante. Playing a villain is such a fun
Mm.
opportunity whenever that arises. And Bramante was really passionate about bringing the studies of antiquity from Milan to Rome and was a painter himself too. So when it came to the Sistine Chapel specifically, there's this huge debate about pulleys versus scaffolding, and Michelangelo was very adamant about it not being pulleys because that's crazy, the idea of dangling from 5 stories up above. So ultimately it became scaffolding, but it really just created this narrative. And Michelangelo was so adamant, like, about not being a painter. He didn't want to be remembered as a painter. He wanted to be remembered as a sculptor. And when when I started to lean into that, I really was curious what would have ultimately brought him to that point of one of the most memorable paintings of all time, and how would have he gotten there? The question really asked the question, how will he finish? Which is what we're really interested in exploring and digging into with this story.
Yeah, the trials of art production.
Yeah,
And of course,
exactly.
Bramante had a relative nearby working on frescoes in the Vatican. Who is that? Remind us.
Raphael.
Yeah, Raphael. Yeah.
And that became a big question too, is like where Raphael is in proximity during this story, which has been really great to start to piece in as well.
So, okay, so we've talked about Piero a bit, we've talked about Bramante a bit, and in these decades that sort of last between Florence and Rome for Michelangelo, there's a few popes involved in this history, and of course we spend a lot of time in the Vatican. So what about the popes? What are your treatment of the popes, and how do they manifest in your work?
Yeah, the goal with the popes is to showcase the characters in a way that history might not often recognize them. So we're really trying to subvert authority with who's playing the popes. There's the performer track for this is really open to interpretation. Casting, when it comes to that, there's a certain energy and element to it that's really important in the room. And that's like first and foremost what's driving decisions about who's playing these parts. The popes are played by the same performer track that is also played by Lorenzo Medici. So the actor who's playing the popes literally and figuratively get to wear many hats in the process. And it's really been a lot of fun to just see how that track has evolved.
Okay, I understand. So you have actors who are playing different characters in different time periods. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. A lot of the tracks are doubled. And if Piero is love and Bramante is opposition, and Francesco is this grounding part of the play, the popes really exemplify the pressure that Michelangelo is under to finish this work.
So you mentioned that the casting for the popes subverts traditional authority, something like that. You said. Can you go back to that and bring us up to speed?
Yeah. In terms of subverting authority, the goal of the popes is really just to have somebody in the role that is a bold reimagination of like what the traditional authority looks like, right? Somebody who isn't historically a white male, which is what we're used to seeing the popes look like.
Right. So not an old white guy for the popes, essentially.
Exactly.
It's so even in the casting decisions, there's a type of queering that's taking place.
That's right.
Lovely. I understand now. Perfect, perfect. So we've got this queering in the narrative, we've got this queering in the casting, and so sometimes, and we've talked a lot about contemporary LGBTQ culture. I'm thinking of things like drag. I'm thinking of things that intentionally border a type of performance and camp and comedy. How is that manifesting?
Totally. Camping comedy, I'm so glad you mentioned that, are my favorite. And I think a lot of my initial writing lends to that really well. But as I developed this piece further and spent more time with these characters and the world building around that, there really was this authenticity and sincerity that was required to tell the story and brought it to where it is today. So the tone of the piece has really evolved into what we're calling queer melodrama. It sort of blends plays that have infused it or helped inspired it in the past to something that's uniquely its own. And it's camp, it's heart, it's sincere, and I think ultimately it'll leave an audience feeling uplifted and hopeful is the goal and what we're trying to aim for here.
I like that. And I think about your title too, Mikey, with an exclamation point. Which funny enough, Michelangelo is one of these figures in the Renaissance. It's really, really common for Renaissance people, not the listeners, the people of the Renaissance people to get these funny diminutive nicknames. And Michelangelo never got one. He only got very esteemed ones. They called him the divine, right? They called him the great. But for example, I think of this all the time. Really, I do think of this all the time. I don't know why. The early Renaissance painters like Masaccio and Masolino, who were both named Tommaso, but that really means in a way like little Tom and like bad Tom, you know? So
Oh,
you get these
interesting.
so cute nicknames for Renaissance artists. Like Donatello is because his name was Donato. He's little Donato, right? Like these
Yeah,
cute little names, which Michelangelo never got, but in your play he does. He gets Mikey, right?
yeah,
Which I think is a cute little touch to the idea of
yeah.
camp and comedy, but also your play between art and history, right? Creativity and history.
And he was really interested in having his history recorded a certain way, and ultimately, like things weren't always recorded in a way that we recognize today, which is really interesting to your point too.
A lot of people, people who come to this podcast at least, or people who go to historically based theater, a lot of times you get historical purists. So I want to talk about your relationship. How are you working with the actual history, and
Yeah.
maybe how are you adapting it for modern production? Because there's a lot of comedy, there's a lot of very modern LGBTQ plus cultural tropes. How
Hmm.
are you negotiating those two spaces?
Great question. It really starts with the history, but this is not a history play, and it's been about really crafting the history in a way that it makes sense chronologically, but then sort of stripping that back to get to the heart of what's going on for these characters. Michelangelo's right hand and best friend who he studied with, Francesco Bernacchi, was like there to help him paint the Sistine Chapel. And a big part of this story too, Francesco is really this grounding presence that exemplifies humanity. And actually, by the end of the story, is like the only sane person in the room. Leaning into LGBT tropes has been really important in that, just because I think the story unfolds in this and becomes this gothic dream, and it exists someplace between the Renaissance and today. And when you actually look closely, there's not too many cultural differences between then and now in some ways. Yeah, so it's been a lot about knowing the history, but then letting go of that to really get to what's at the heart of this story.
Are there, reading through some of the script and seeing a lot of these ideas, what are the modern elements of LGBTQ culture that you're using in this play?
Great question. When it comes to Francesco specifically, we're leaning into what gender identity means and the exploration of that. In Roman times, they acknowledged a third gender, and that's something that Francesco really reckons with at the beginning of the play and is something that we're interested in leaning into further as we continue development.
Okay, Justin, to conclude our conversation here, can you tell us how people can access, see, or support your project?
Yeah, thank you. And the show's coming up here soon. May will be here in no time, and we'll be at the Tank Theater May 19th, 26th, 28th, 30th, and 31st. And tickets are on sale now, tanknyc.com. There will also include a link in the show notes here. So stay tuned. Look forward to being in touch, and you can find us also on Instagram at Mikey the Play.
Renaissance people, Justin Garascia's play Mikey will be at the Tank Theater in New York City this coming May. Please check out the links in the show notes. And I want to thank you all for welcoming him to our conversations here on the Italian Renaissance podcast. Thank you, Justin. Until next time, Renaissance people, arrivederci.